Well, for more on this report, we're now joined via Zoom by Peter Kamalingin, who's with Oxfam International, and he's the Pan-African Director and Representative to the African Union. Thanks so much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program. We mentioned some of what's in the report, but what would you say are the biggest findings and the biggest areas of concern for you as Oxfam?
Thank you very much, Peter, and thanks for this opportunity to speak to this report that Oxfam has just released. We released a report yesterday called the Commitment to Reducing Inequality Report. We do this across many countries in the world, and I think over the last several months, we have released regional reports for Southern Africa, West Africa, and also Eastern Africa. And the one we have now, we have a brief for the whole continent that gives us a picture of where we are as a continent in terms of reducing inequality. Now, what we do with these reports, Peter, is that we rank countries on a number of parameters to demonstrate the policy steps that governments take to reduce inequality, or the things that they do that actually widen inequality. And we prioritize three major areas. And we have this report we're talking about, we've ranked 47 countries based on their policy performance, as I said, to reduce inequalities through one, public services, progressive taxation, and three, labor rights. Those are the areas that we think, the policy areas that we think that when governments do more on those areas, when they invest more in social services, when they actually work towards more progressive rather than regressive tax policy frameworks, and where they also have labor rights, where they have, the right to formation of trade unions, you actually make a lot of progress on inequality. So this paper that we are speaking to today highlights a number of points. Number one is that inequality is growing in Africa, and it has been worsened by the COVID-19 pandemic. We're seeing that the top 1% of Africans now hold 33% of the wealth of the continent. And governments are facing serious expenditure cuts of about 5.7% of their GDP, and the situation is bound to be worse. And of course, even by the time we were finalizing the report, we hadn't even seen the ramifications of what's happening, for example, the war in Ukraine, which has affected the global food value chains to a level where some of our countries in the continent, mostly Northern Africa and even parts of the Horn, are net importers of, for example, wheat, and the prices have skyrocketed. So things are really worsening. And there are a number of areas. And this is not something that is new. It is coming on top of a trend that we have seen over the years. Before this pandemic, Africa, 52% of Africans lacked access to healthcare. 83% lacked access to social spending. There was nothing like social protection for 83% of the population. And 53% lacked formal labor rights. And we are now in a situation where 67% of African workers were either unemployed, underemployed, or actually employed in jobs that do not have formal contracts. So that means that they are very vulnerable already. And this is becoming very difficult now because COVID-19 has also meant that governments have had to borrow more and make worse the debt burden to a level where in some, the average is about 51% money being spent on repayment of debt. In some countries, it is probably going toward 70%. And that means that there's a huge opportunity cost for people, particularly the vulnerable people. And I think that we are having more disasters, climate crisis, some of the things that we are hearing, for example, in your neighborhood in Southern Africa, you will see that, these storms, these rains and the floods are impacting people, but actually the poor people, the vulnerable people who are in informal settlements are the ones that are going to be worse hit off. So we are seeing that, everything seems to be coming together to make things more difficult for people, and governments are finding it difficult to create the necessary physical space to be able to finance public services and recover in a more just, fair manner.
We'll talk about government policy, interventions, and maybe even failings just now. But you did mention something which is something that we've noticed over time. Countries in Africa end up in certain situations, then they go to lenders to borrow money. These lenders say, yes, we'll give you money, but, and it's that but that often becomes a weight around our necks, isn't it? When we start looking at some of these austerity measures that are required, these cuts in expenditure. What's your take as Oxfam on this? Because the lenders for sure want to get their money back, but they also want to make sure that money isn't misspent and it's used properly. So how do you balance these two? Because African nations are saying that this is a millstone around our necks.
Yeah, I think that is true in many ways. First of all, it is important to realize that African governments, we will come about the responsibilities that they have as governments on their own, as sovereign leaders of, sovereign governments. But I think it is important that of the bigger picture is that we are within a global system that has over the years, over centuries actually, been built to become exclusive. It is racist in many ways, it is colonial, it's exclusive, it's unfair, it's unjust. So that is important to acknowledge first, that there is actually something, and people are being talked about now reparatory justice in itself. So there's a context in which all this is happening. And that's not to absolve governments from responsibility. But it's important to see that, for example, many of the debts that are being incurred are based on, agreements that people reach, that, some of the debts are, the money that is being borrowed are unnecessarily costly. They are being invested in things that don't necessarily yield returns. And of course, they are omissions by governments as well. But it is also part of conditions that come from the rich countries. When you are, my father used to tell me that, poverty is a bad thing. When you are poor, somebody can take away your thing, including your own wife when you're watching. It's a big problem that we are working in. But Africa is trying to recover now from COVID-19. Issues of climate, for example, the injustices around it. There are certain things that are beyond the means and the control of average African governments. But there's something unjust in the global system that needs to be understood within that framework. So Africa is trying to recover from effects of COVID-19, but this debt burden is negatively impacting that recovery and making it extremely difficult for us to do that. We know that, for example, what has happened in the conditions, the austerity conditions that are unfair. We are saying, for example, that there's some positive steps that the IMF and the IFI institutions have taken to say, okay, there's a provision for special drawing rights of up to, say, $100 billion available for countries. But then they also still come with conditions. So we are saying that there's actually a lot of need for these to be, opened up, the conditions to be eased up a bit so that there's a justice lens to it, and African governments can be able to borrow this money and not end up being more indebted and making it extremely difficult for them to recover.
How much culpability is there in African governments? So we've talked about the lenders, but when we see across the continent luxury cars being bought for state officials and things like that, it doesn't paint a picture of funds being used properly.
Yeah, I think that all governments everywhere, Peter, are potentially problematic. But I think that what is always going to make a difference is the degree to which citizens have the space and the means and the agency to affect and impact positively the behavior of governments. The problem we're having at the moment is that African citizens are not yet either socially mobilized or actually they are too poor to organize themselves in a way that can meaningfully change the way governments behave. And potentially all governments can do the same. It's only that there are always going to be civic checks and balances. And I think that that's where we have a challenge. Now, it becomes more difficult if the rich countries and the rich corporates and the big private sector, the moneyed guys, actually collude with the governments and make it extremely difficult for governments, for citizens to actually change that. And that's why we have said that, there's also a lot of state capture. For example, one of the things that need to change significantly is, for example, the African governments to expand the tax base to tax, for example, the wealth a bit more. We still have a lot of regressive tax policy regimes. But now when governments and the rich are together, it becomes very difficult to actually tax fairly. And you end up, going to taxes that are going to make things very difficult for the poor people. So that partnership, that mischievous partnership between the rich and the state is making it extremely difficult. So it is a chicken and egg. And in any case, Peter, part of the things that citizens need to have is, of course, to be educated. to get access to information, get access to radio, to listen to things, to read about what's happening in different parts of the world. You don't do that if you are not educated, if we still have a lot of people dropping out of school. You don't do that if you're poor. This is the problem. So there's need for investment in social services, which actually progressively yield also more competent citizens, more engaged citizens who can actually be part of this agency that brings governments that are responsive to their needs. So I think that we are in a bit of a catch-22 situation.
All right. Well, some of it actually...
But I think that there's a bigger responsibility, Peter, for the rich countries to do that, yeah.
But there's also, I don't want to run away too much from our own responsibility, because investing in healthcare, hospitals, clinics is not something we need to wait for anybody, but that is part of the story of inequality. If you're wealthy in Africa, you're going to get the best healthcare. If you are poor, sadly, you could die from something that's preventable. And it seems that not all our governments are digging deep and allocating enough resources to healthcare, maybe buying more military hardware than building hospitals.
Absolutely, that is true. That is true, Peter. And that is why I said that governments would ordinarily do that if they have the choice and if they have the way. It is going to require citizens to organize themselves, to connect beyond boundaries, but also to build global solidarity so that there's a true global partnerships that actually enforce these normative rules to make things harder and more difficult for governments to do what they like, but do things that are important for the people. So it is true. But where is the solution? The solution is always going to be, yes, for people to vote them out, to change governments, to actually change behavior. It's going to be difficult. It will require quite a bit more effort, and it's going to be a sustained effort, and it is going to require more stronger partnerships than we are seeing across the continent. And that is why we are highlighting these issues and bringing them to space. That's why it's good to have a SABC highlighting these issues so that consistently, without tiring, we are able to increase citizen awareness across countries, across societies, so that we are able to build enough agency among people of goodwill. There are enough good people in the world to actually cause changes that we need. The only problem is sometimes they are not connected, and a lot of these efforts are done and executed in a disjointed manner.
What do fair tax regimes look like? I look at a country like South Africa, for example, and it's actually quite a small percentage of people that pay the majority of the tax. Then I look at a country like Zimbabwe that'll tell you that there's 90% unemployment, which means a lot of revenue is flowing through informal systems, and so there is no tax going through to the treasury. What does one do in those situations? Because this certainly then contributes to Treasury not having funds and having to cut expenditure and further increasing the inequality gap.
Absolutely, that is true. One of the biggest big problems that we are facing as a continent is what we have called the illicit financial flows. Some of the recent studies have shown that, Africa as a continent is probably losing anything between $60 to $70 billion every year through illicit financial flows. Again, that is mostly commonly a partnership between, states and the big corporates. It is also weaknesses and loopholes in the global tax policy frameworks. And that's why in the past we have also called that there's need actually for global tax policy frameworks, including, governance, consistent standards, so that it becomes difficult for people to put money and stash it away in tax havens. We see many of them in different parts of the world, majority of them, of course, outside the continent. So I think that there's quite a lot of problems. We're seeing that, for example, Africa probably collects only hardly less than 30%, probably 29% of the taxes that are applied. So that there's a whole area of 70% that is not being collected. And this requires, policy constraints, things that are, collaboration between countries. First of all, for example, within the region, within the continent, to make sure that, these companies, these big corporates, are not playing us and putting us in what we have called the rest of the bottom. They come to one country and make us compete instead of collaborating to actually tax consistently, so that we are not playing one regime against the other in the spirit of competition. For example, these tax incentives that are being given that don't have a lot of meaning in itself. So I think there's quite a lot of work that needs to be done. But we have said that, for example, under the global framework, we pushed for this a few years ago, but we haven't reached a global position on this, because there's a lot of unfair competition and fairness. People are thriving from the injustice in the global trade system, and they are normally less reluctant to be able to enforce certain things. And of course, for a continent like ours, which is resource rich, even for the new resources, new minerals, or things that are going to be needed, for example, in the new in the transition, new energy transition that is going to be required. These are Africa is a continent that is still rich with these resources, but a lot of it is captured space by big corporates whose turnover sometimes is higher than the average governments in our region. And the partnerships that we are seeing are not those that are transforming things.
We've run out of time, but I do want us to bring it back to the real story, actually, is that the cost of inequality is often people dying, isn't it? I mean, this is a serious issue that we really do need to address urgently.
Yeah, inequality kills, we have said it. Only 4 countries, for example, in Africa, are meeting their commitments on for example, spending 15% of their budgets, annual budgets, on health. We said that many years ago. We met in Abuja. That is not being realized. 42 AU member states are planning to cut spending by a cumulative 5.5% of the GDP this year. That means that the poor people are not going to have the services they need. It's going to be privatized. A lot of these issues are impacting people disproportionately. So yes, it is killing people, and it is as bad as that, Peter. It is something that is urgent. It is something that we cannot afford to keep quiet. Things have to change, and they have to change significantly. And if you look at it in the triple effect, you have COVID-19, you now have climate crisis that is worsening for the continent, and then we have a lot of conflicts that are happening. And of course, we are now seeing that whatever is happening in other parts of the world, whether that was viruses or even the conflicts as we see in Ukraine, and that is having direct impact on all of us. We see what it is meaning, for example, the inflation rate sweeping across the continent. These are not just statistics. These are things that have live implications for the majority of the people in the continent. And Africa cannot afford to lose this century again. The continent has already suffered too much. There's some sense of urgency, and we really have to work together as people, and also build global partnerships to be able to generate enough pressure for our governments to behave differently.